talk about it with anybody who wishes to. IVF is a process. It is a long process. It's not something that you just go to the doctor one time and this happens. So having to pause, and it's expensive, it's painful, and it's very drawn out. And so this pause in women's treatment across the state of Alabama was devastating. It also does it wreaks havoc on a woman's body to just abruptly stop what's happening in the IVF process. So, and in addition to that, it just threw the lives of couples across the state into disarray, people who were longing and hoping for children. And IVF, for most people who use it, is close to a step of last resort, if not the last resort. So these are people who had already gone through long, arduous journeys to get to where they were. So in the aftermath of that terrible decision, so many of my colleagues, including so many of the people here, spoke out, sharing their personal experiences with infertility and reproductive technologies, and sharing their support for the Access to Family Building Act and protecting IVF, as well as other assisted reproductive technologies for all Americans. And so I'm grateful for everyone's support here. It's time, I believe, for Americans to see where all members of the House of Representatives stand on this critically important issue. We've heard a lot of noise from people who say they don't agree with the Alabama decision, and yet they have not rushed to sign on to this bill. And when I say people, I'm talking about my colleagues across the aisle. Right now we have 4 Republicans who have signed on, and yet many, many claim to support IVF. So words of support are nice to hear, but Americans need action, not empty promises. And so I'm asking my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to put their money where their mouth is. Join me as a co-sponsor of this bill, and let's get this to a vote on the House floor. And just on a personal note, I have to say that being a parent to my 2 adult children, Clay, who's now 31, and Adrian, who's 28, is the greatest joy of my life. They are my rocks. But I, too, struggled with infertility for years before I had my firstborn. I remember it all too well, even though he's now 31 years old. It's traumatic, and I just can't explain what it's like when you actually finally conceive and then give birth to a child, and that feeling of relief that you're going to be able to do something that so many people just take for granted. So I'm really thankful that when I underwent this, when I was hoping to grow my family, I had access to multiple forms of reproductive technologies, not all the forms they have now, but even so, over the course of my struggle with it, I went through heartbreak, fear, desperation, this feeling of this never going to happen for me and my husband. And so it just makes me, and I put myself in other women's shoes, other couples' shoes, when I think about them being denied IVF access. And it just infuriates me that judges and politicians, people with no medical background, no credentials, no expertise, think that they have any right to tell these women what they can do with their bodies, or these couples whether they're going to be able to pursue what may be their only chance at growing a family. So I think as legislators, our most basic duty is to make life better for the people we have been sent here to represent. I take this as a very serious responsibility, and I know all of my colleagues on the stage do as well. So it's a fight. We can win. I truly believe that if we all work together. I do hope that our colleagues across the aisle will hear the American people loud and clear and understand that IVF is something that we should be embracing, that we should be encouraging if people need it. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues here. And first, I'm going to turn it over to Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz to say a few words.
Susan, thank you for this box.
Wow. You can always count on me, Debbie.
Awesome. Oh, my God. I got to go get me one of those. Susan, you just brought the most joyous memory that my husband and I had in our lives together, when we found out after we went through IVF that it was successful and that I was pregnant. And then when we went to our first ultrasound a couple of weeks later and found out we were having twins, we were laughing with joy. Literally laughing. And I had not thought about that moment in a while. So thank you. And thank you so much to Congresswoman Wild, to our colleagues here, to my sister, Sydney Kamlager-Dove, who's also been through the trials of infertility, and so many millions of Americans who are impacted by infertility. I mean, I was 29 years old, and we had been trying for a year. We had actually waited. We had been married 7 years. We, took the time to wait, build our careers, and enjoy some life together first. And in a billion years, we never thought, Steve and I, never thought that it would be hard, to conceive. And after a year of trying, we were advised, go to a fertility specialist because it's, not a typical result to not be pregnant when you were at that stage of life. And so we were told at the time that really because of the particular problem that we had, that the only way we could conceive was through IVF. And thanks to that incredible scientific miracle, we were able to conceive our twins, Rebecca and Jake, who are healthy 25-year-olds today. And then we had our third child, Shelby, naturally. So something sorted itself out, thankfully. But seeing that struggle up close, I've fought for years to help expand healthcare coverage access for a prohibitively expensive fertility treatment that not just makes it accessible, to make it not just accessible, but to affordable to those who need it. And here's another important wrinkle to this, especially as we have advanced in the 25 years since I was fortunate enough to become a parent. As a breast cancer survivor, I survived breast cancer after a diagnosis at 41 and learned that I was a carrier of the BRCA2 genetic mutation, which I can pass by myself on to my children. And so that new wrinkle is that we have now spent that time worrying, did I pass that genetic mutation on to my children? Are they at greater risk for breast cancer, for ovarian cancer, for other kinds of cancer? And now, thanks to the miracle of IVF and the ability to select out, if you go through IVF and you can, you have a number of embryos, you can test the embryos to see whether they carry the various genetic mutations. So my children, if God forbid one of them or any of them have the BRCA2 mutation, they could choose when they decide to have children whether or not to go through IVF and only implant embryos that don't carry that mutation, and that would end the cycle of genetic cancer in my family. So if you prohibit IVF, not only are you stopping people from being able to have families and interfering with the most personal, private decision that a couple makes, or that an individual makes if they choose to have a child on their own, you are also preventing the life-saving ability to stop cancer and other diseases in their tracks. And that is absolutely unacceptable. And we have to make sure that we don't create anxious, desperate, frightened families who extreme Republicans are torturing by threatening the ability to use IVF to start their families or save their families. That's why my cancer survivorship bill expands Medicaid coverage so that cancer patients aren't forced to forfeit parenthood to stay alive. And now IVF has enabled millions of Americans to deliver babies. There remain substantial medical, financial, and health equity barriers that stand in the way of so many who require medical assistance. And we cannot allow the extremist Republican agenda to add yet another barrier to an already difficult and heartbreaking process. By wielding an extreme reading of the Bible, only using one religion's version of what is acceptable in terms of decision-making about fertility, Republicans nearly banned IVF in Alabama, and after that, some advocates warned families to move frozen eggs out of Texas. And I fear that more states will follow. These laws place government in our personal family decisions. They inflict legal chaos and uncertainty on doctors, fertility clinics, and prospective parents. And any state with so-called personhood laws could be the next Alabama, where anxious, desperate, and frightened families become subject to this MAGA Republican torture. No judge or politician should have autonomy over a woman's future. All women deserve the freedom to choose IVF or any form of fertility treatment to be able to start their families, or birth control or abortion for that matter. And for this reason, it is essential that Congress pass Congresswoman Wild's Access to Family Building Act, which will protect IVF and all reproductive care. Last week, extremist Senate Republicans blocked this bill, but hear us now. We will not back down. The ability to have children and the timing of building a family is a basic human right, and the Access to Family Building Act will ensure that parents battling infertility can continue to grow their families and save lives. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And with that, I'll turn it over to Congresswoman Houlihan.
Thanks, Susan. I think I
I
may be tall enough not to need the stool, although I am not that tall. Hi, everybody. I'm Chrissy Houlihan, also from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I come here to speak very quickly a couple of things that have not yet been said, but would emphasize why this is important and why now. The Senate is taking a vote on this issue right now. If you're of a certain age, which I am, to remember your schoolhouse rock, there is a requirement that even if that were to pass on the Senate side, that we, of course, also need to pass that, a version of that, at least in the House side as well, for it to be a law. And I do genuinely believe if push came to shove and everybody were required to make an honest vote on this, that we would vote to pass this on both sides, both the Senate and the House. Whether or not an honest vote will happen or whether a vote will happen at all, it remains to be seen, and that's why I'm standing here to push the importance of making sure that we take this bill up in the House as well as in the Senate. So that's the first thing, is we have an opportunity. We are actually legislators and lawmakers, and the American people are demanding that we settle this, and we can settle this. So that's the first issue. The second thing I want to emphasize is, as Susan and my colleagues inevitably will also say, this is about the right that people have to choose when, where, and how, and with whom they have a family. In a nation where we purportedly value families, we don't do a whole lot to put our money where our mouth is, and this is one way which we can do that. I will highlight and elevate two communities that I think are particularly important to me. The veteran and military community, which I believe needs rights and access to these sorts of treatments and technologies, and also the LGBTQ community as well. So I think that this is something that's not just about our traditional vision and version of a family, but is a vision of what a family looks like, no matter what the family looks like. We have the opportunity, the right, and the privilege to have children, and that should be protected by the lawmakers of this land. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I pass it back over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much, Rep. Houlihan. And I'd like to invite Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove to make a few remarks.
Thank you, Susan. And I know I don't need the box. So hello, everyone. I am Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove from Los Angeles, and I really think that it is shameful that once again we Democrats are standing here talking about this issue and really asking our Republican colleagues in both the Senate and the House to step up and do their job and protect women and protect families. Many of us have been sharing stories, but the reality is we are fighting with the federal government and also with states as they begin to enact laws to really essentially force sterilization through the constriction of IVF and other fertility treatments. And that is not drama. I am saying something very real. We are talking about choices being taken off the table for women. The United States is incredibly provincial when it comes to sex and talking about sex, and also when it comes to talking about the challenges of conception. And yet so many families struggle with trying to conceive each and every day. My story is I was very excited about the possibility of trying to have a family. We were unsuccessful in the natural ways, and so we looked to science. And I was poked and prodded and had eggs taken from me and all of these things being put into petri dishes. And after months and months, many, many months, close to a year, exhausting many of our financial reserves, we had to turn to IVF. And that was a traumatic experience, emotionally, financially, physically, the stress that it puts on a family and extended families, parents hoping to be grandparents, waiting for you to give them the call saying, this has happened. And eventually, I was successful in having 3 stepchildren. My story is not dissimilar from many others. What I had, though, was the option. I had the choice to use fertility treatments to help me with my journey. And that is what is being taken away from millions of women and families across this country. As an African American woman, I think there is a stigma attached with having to say you're having a hard time having a child. But that is why we should be leaning into science and protecting it and protecting the providers that are offering this service. And many providers now are afraid to lean into fertility treatments and to talk about the different sciences that are available because of what we are seeing happen at the state levels and at the federal level. So the debate over IVF began in February when the right-wing Alabama Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are children and that those who destroy them could be held liable for wrongful death. Alabama's ruling resulted in the immediate pause of IVF services, putting dreams on pause. Thankfully, providers in Alabama have since been able to resume some of the in vitro fertilization services, but unfortunately, MAGA Republicans in Congress have already drawn inspiration from this draconian ruling. So in February, Representative Rosendale led a letter with Freedom Caucus members opposing the VA's planned expansion of IVF services. And when that didn't work, he filed an amendment to the Milcon VA bill to ban IVF, access to IVF and other fertility treatments for veterans. So if we're asking our female veterans to continue to defend our country, don't you think we should be defending their right to make a decision about how to have a child? We need to push the Senate to force a vote on this, and we need to do our job in the House to bring forth Representative Wild's bill, Access to Family Building Act, so that we can force a vote and have people show their cards, show their receipts about how they care about and what they're willing to do to protect a woman's right to choose and a woman's right to choose how she is going to try and conceive and have a family. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me just say on the issue of military families, I've heard from many, and I'm actually, I grew up as a military brat myself, so I know that the struggles that those families go through, they move every couple of years. And one of the greatest concerns they have is they never know where their next assignment is. And this is why we need federal codification of this right, because it's so unfair to our military families to face the prospect of either not being able to continue IVF treatment or get it at all, depending on what their next duty station is. And with that, I'm just going to ask our in-house scientist, our resident scientist, Representative Foster, to say a few words. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. As the token scientist up on the stage here, there's nothing I'm more proud of as a scientist than science's ability to deliver miraculous gifts like in vitro fertilization to families that would not have been able to have children. And I think probably almost every one of us knows someone who has benefited from IVF and can testify to the life-changing benefit that gives. And when I see Republicans in Congress and in the Senate acting to strip that benefit away, it's wrong at many different levels. And that threat ends with the passage of Representative Wild's bill. So I urge a prompt vote and for every member of Congress to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Any questions? Okay. Sir?
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Sure.
Are there any lessons that House Democrats have learned from the Dobbs decision as you defend IVF, contraception, these other reproductive technologies that you've mentioned? How has the Dobbs decision changed how you frame these issues with your constituents back home as Republicans continue to, as you mentioned, not join Democrats in protecting them?
Well, a reading of the Dobbs decision is actually what led me to craft this bill. I read Justice Thomas's opinion, and it was quite clear that there was much more on the chopping block being envisioned. And my thoughts immediately went to IVF because I have so many people in my circle of friends and family who have needed it. But I think that what we have learned is that things that we once took for granted cannot be taken for granted. The idea that Roe versus Wade, which was decided when I was in college, 50 years later, was overturned is just staggering to me. So I just think something that we took, as I said, things that we take for granted, personal liberties, which everybody claims to consider to be incredibly important. I include in that the right to control your own body. So I think what we have learned is not to ever underestimate the GOP in terms of their willingness to infringe upon people's rights and liberties.
And the only thing I'll add is that another important element of what we've learned is that we have to make sure that voters understand that post-Roe, post-Dobbs, reproductive freedom is on the ballot. And that is not specifically defined or limited just to a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy and leaving that decision between her family and her faith and her doctor, that any form of reproductive freedom is on the ballot because we need to make sure that we have a pro-reproductive freedom majority in the United States Congress.
Yes.
Thank you. So in the Senate, Republicans actually today introduced a bill to promote restorative reproductive medicine, which is a practice that anti-abortion groups say is an ethical alternative to IVF and reproductive technologies. And we're also saying that they don't oppose IVF. And so I wanted to get your reaction. Is it something that you think you can work with?
I have not seen that proposal yet. I will tell you that in the House, we had at least one Republican colleague who introduced what was supposed to be her version of protecting IVF, and it turned out to be a completely non-binding resolution, a statement of support, which doesn't do anybody any good if their rights are being taken away. So I'd have to look at it. I don't know. I'm happy to work with anybody on this issue, but I am skeptical about whether it does what it needs to do. Yes.
I have a two-parter, if that's okay.
How about the first part, and then I go to somebody else?
Sure.
Okay.
The handful of Republican co-sponsors that you have on this bill, have you spoken to them about a potential discharge petition to force a floor vote?
I'm in the midst of doing that. A couple of them I haven't been able to find on the floor. I've spoken to a couple of them. They're aware that we are considering that. We would, if we have to do that, we will go the discharge petition route. But you all know that discharge petitions are challenging. You've got to get 218 people to sign. We have 213 Democrats as of last count. So if we got all the Democrats and the 4 Republicans who have signed on, we're still short 1. I wouldn't mind being in that position and trying to find that one Republican who's brave enough to sign the discharge petition. So we're working on it is the answer to that. Yes.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So Donald Trump met with congressional Republicans today, and he has notably come out and said that he does support IVF in the wake of the Alabama ruling. I'm wondering how you think that bodes both for today's Senate vote and for your bill in the House.
I hope that it bodes well for the Senate vote. I didn't hear his remarks. I've read this much, and I know that that President Trump has said that in the past, in fact, shortly after the Alabama decision, he made remarks like that, and yet we haven't seen anything on the GOP side that's meaningful and substantive on this issue. So, as I said in my remarks, actions speak a lot louder than words. So I hope his comments, I didn't hear them, but I hope they're helpful to the Senate vote today, but who knows? And will it get a vote in the House? Under today's leadership in the House, absent a discharge petition, it's very hard to imagine this coming to a vote.
And I'll just add, comments are not codification. We need codification, not comments.
Right.
Because the only way that we can ensure that women's reproductive decisions aren't further eroded, like they were completely obliterated with Dobbs, is to put it in federal law and ensure that, like Congresswoman Wild's bill does, ensure the right to making your own family planning, family building decisions, including IVF, that are protected in federal statutes.
Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about this, but can you tell me how you sort of get a vote on this, or what's the plan for kind of generating this as getting support for it? I'm curious, what is this?
Well, the plan is, first of all, to get as many co-sponsors as possible on the bill, and that is still a work in progress. And then secondly would be most likely in this Congress to do it by way of discharge petition. But as I said before, I need to make sure that we have enough support on the Republican side to make that a meaningful exercise. I do think that putting a discharge petition forth, which we have not yet, would put a tremendous amount of favorable pressure on the Republicans who have co-sponsored it. I think there's a reason they co-sponsored the bill. Their voters support IVF. And I will tell you, I know just anecdotally from talking to people in my district, this is really not a political issue. Senator Romney is the one who said that he would have fewer grandchildren if it were not for IVF. This is something that really has legs on both sides of the aisle. So I think that may be the only strategy that we can employ this Congress. In January, we may approach it differently. Yes, sir.
So I know you sort of addressed this in an oblique way a little bit, but some of the Republicans are saying that IVF is already legal in all the states, and that this is just a Democrat messaging bill before the election. How do you respond to that?
Well, all you have to do is look at real life examples. We know in Alabama that right after that court decision, the clinics shut down their operations, paused their operations, I should say. And as I mentioned before, the process of IVF is lengthy. It's not like you can just say, oh, not this week, maybe we'll come back to it. It's very time sensitive. And I have constituents who are military families, I mentioned those before, who have talked about their concerns of not being able to get IVF treatment at their next duty station because that whatever state they might get assigned to has restrictive laws. The problem is that without the certainty of federal codification, you are leaving it up to the whim of state courts, state legislators, which gives nobody any kind of confidence about what they can do in this area. And that's why it's so important. This is not a messaging bill. This is literally about one of the most fundamental rights we have, which is to start and grow a family. Yes, ma'am.
Some Republicans have proposed restricting surrogacy, which obviously with IVF is an important way many families, including LGBTQ families, build their families with IVF. Is this bill planning to expand to protect surrogacy as well?
We haven't looked into that yet. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Yes.
Thanks, Congresswoman. You mentioned this issue kind of has legs on both sides. Why do you think it's been hard for both Republicans and Democrats to come to some kind of compromise?
Because there are organizations out there that are lobbying, the folks who believe that life begins at conception, at the moment of conception, are out there lobbying my GOP colleagues very, very hard in a very threatening kind of way. I suspect that most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not fundamentally opposed to IVF, but they are afraid of the power of organizations to go out there and misconstrue their support for this. I think if they listen to their electorate rather than listening to lobbying organizations, they will find that their electorate is widely supportive. You had another part. Go ahead.
Sorry, I know you're here to speak about your bill, but I did want to ask
That's okay.
your reaction to the Supreme Court ruling today on
Yeah.
the birthstone that the plaintiffs have left standing.
Well, so I was initially, I have not read the decision yet. I was initially very encouraged by the news. However, I've, in the last half hour, come to realize that they based their decision on a matter of standing, that the plaintiffs don't have standing. At least that's my understanding of their decision. So it's not really a decision on the merits. It means that another set of plaintiffs who do have standing could come forward and we'd get a different decision. So obviously, we'll take the win for now, but it's I don't think we should by any means think that that's an indication that the Supreme Court is going to suddenly be in favor of women's reproductive rights, at the Supreme Court as a whole. So I think it's really important that people understand it was almost a technicality that they decided it on. That's why it was a unanimous decision. Yes.
On IVF, I wanted to ask about all these IVF Republican bills that they've introduced. Do they have any sort of merit, or is this them kind of responding to the criticism that they've gotten?
The latter. Not a single one has any teeth to it. And by the way, if there was one that mirrored this or similar, I'd be signing on to it and helping whoever wrote that bill get it to a vote. But those are messaging bills, and they don't have any teeth. Yes.
I have a second question. Thank you. I wanted to ask, you had briefly mentioned the role that religion has played. So delegates at the Southern Baptist Convention yesterday voted to condemn IVF, and there's, they report that they have nearly 13 million constituents following that denomination. I'm wondering what your response is to that.
Well, again, I feel strongly that a medical decision should strictly be between an individual, woman, or in the case of men's medical treatment, a man, and their health care provider. And it is up to an individual to make a decision about their faith and where that enters into their personal decision, whatever the medical treatment might be. But there is no reason that, let's say it's a politician or a judge who happens to subscribe to the Southern Baptist thinking on this. Why should that person be able to bind everybody else who doesn't share in that same religious? This faith, just like medical care, is a very personal thing. And so that's my reaction to it. And, we good? Okay, great. Thank you so much for all your interest. Really appreciate it, everybody. Take care.